Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau's Older Americans Month webinar on financial caregiving. Today, we're pleased to be joined by two experts from the Center for Financial Security to discuss financial caregiving issues. As you may know, this year's theme for Older Americans Month is Communities of Strength, and that's a theme that takes on new meaning during the pandemic. So today, we're going to discuss caregiving trends, then highlight some tools and resources to help financial caregivers during the pandemic and beyond. And in the spirit of Older Americans Month, we hope that the information that we share will help you to make your communities stronger. Now let me begin by introducing today's speakers. My name is Lisa Schifferle, and I'm a Senior Policy Analyst in the Office for Older Americans at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Today, I'm fortunate to be joined by two experts from the Center for Financial Security, Dr. Mary Hamman and Dr. Yulya Truskinovsky. Dr. Hamman is an Associate Professor of Economics at the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse and also Associate Director of the Retirement and Disability Research Center at University of Wisconsin-Madison's Center for Financial Security. Dr. Hamman's current research agenda focuses on understanding trends in living arrangements of financially vulnerable older adults. She holds a PhD from Michigan State University, and we are really happy to have her here with us today. Dr. Yulya Truskinovsky is a health economist who studies long-term care and aging. She holds a doctorate in public policy from Duke University and is currently an assistant professor of economics at Wayne State University. Dr. Truskinovsky's current research focuses on the economics of informal care and the impacts of social insurance programs on how individuals and families make decisions about work and family caregiving. We're also very happy to have her here today, and we look forward to both of them sharing their time and expertise on the webinar and look forward to their presentations. Now, here's what we're going to cover. Professor Hamman will open the webinar by discussing trends in long-term care with a focus on low-income older adults. And then Professor Truskinovsky will discuss the effects of family caregiving on employment and how COVID-19 has changed caregiving. Finally, I'll offer some Cfpb resources to support family caregivers during the pandemic and beyond. And at the end, we'll take your questions. So as you listen to the presentations, please do feel free to start putting questions in the chat. Please address them to all panelists. And after our presentations, I'll pose some of your questions to the panelists so you can get them answered. And now I will turn it over to Dr. Hamman.
Lisa, thank you so much for that introduction. So, as Lisa mentioned, I am currently working on a research agenda where I'm studying some of the trends and patterns in the living arrangements of older adults. And I'd like to share with you some of those results, looking back really over about 4 decades. While what I share with you today does not encompass what's currently happened during the COVID-19 pandemic, I know my colleague Yulya will be able to provide some insight there, and I'd be happy to answer some questions as we move to the discussion portion. But before I begin to present some of my research, I wish to gratefully acknowledge support for this project from the Social Security Administration, and also just to note that all of the opinions presented today or any errors or omissions are my own. They do not represent the views of SSA or any agency of the federal government. So I'd like to first begin with a bit of a puzzle. And that's it, despite the fact that our population is aging, there are actually fewer older adults living in nursing homes. And if you note, the date on this site that I have here is 1999. So this is not just a COVID thing or something that has happened quite recently. This is quite a long-term trend. And it's some of that trend that I would like to highlight and dig a bit deeper into with you today. Now, first, I want to share with you that interestingly, this trend is concentrated among the lowest income older adults. And I'm going to take just a moment to break down this graph, and we'll be looking at several versions of this graph as I explain some of the other trends that I found in my research. So what I'm presenting here is the percentage of people who live in an institutional setting, you can think of this as a nursing home, by age. So each dot represents an individual's age, and as you read off the y-axis, that is the percentage who live in a nursing home. Now I have 2 panels here. On the left-hand panel, This is a group that is likely not eligible for SSI. And if you're not familiar with what SSI is, please bear with me. I'll go into details soon. But you can think about that as a group who is not likely to qualify for Medicaid, who has some more financial resources, but are not necessarily wealthy. Whereas the group that's on the right-hand side tend to be very low income and low asset older adults. These are people who would qualify most likely for Medicaid and also for this SSI program. Now, what's interesting here is if we look at the change over time. So looking at the squares, the hollow squares, that represents the percentage of people who lived in a nursing home as of 1980. And the red dots is that same percentage as of 2018. Now, on the left-hand side, people who are more financially well off, there's very little change. The entire decline in nursing home residents appears to be coming from this very low income population. And it's a large decline. So look at the very oldest old, those who are nearly 90 years old. In 1980, about 40% of those individuals lived in a nursing home. Whereas if we look at those people who are nearly 90 years old, as of the most recent data in my work, there's only about 20% who reside in a nursing home. So if nursing home residency is falling, well, where are people living instead? And this is part of what I sought to answer in this particular project. One natural response might be that they're co-residing with others. And when I say co-residing, I don't mean with a spouse or a partner. I mean with other family members, perhaps with adult children, though it could be grandchildren, or it could be unrelated individuals as well. The way that I've conceptualized this is quite broad. And so now I'm showing you these same graphs for the same two groups. Lower income adults are on the right-hand side. And again, the squares are 1980 and the dots are 2018. And we can see that co-residence has increased, especially among the most financially vulnerable households, but not in a pattern that seems related to what we saw for nursing home residents. So remember, most of that decline was concentrated among the very oldest old, whereas co-residence has really expanded at all ages and perhaps more so at the younger end of the old age spectrum. So those who are in their 65 to 70s. And there's also a bit of a difference here. It looks like there's been a decline in the rates of co-residency for the oldest old who are more financially well off. So while there are interesting trends here, it's not entirely clear that this is related to the decline in nursing home residency. And in case you're not convinced, let me break this down just a touch further. I've added some dots here to show you what was happening in the intervening decades. And the lightest of the gray dots is 1990, moving up to the darkest of the gray dots is 2010. And what we can see here is a lot of the increase that was apparent by 2018 really happened between 2000 and 2010. And so if you're thinking Great Recession, that's what I'm thinking as well. I think that there's evidence that there was a lot of doubling up for economic reasons around that time. And then perhaps some of those living arrangements have persisted going forward. What about living in one's own home, what we might consider to be aging in place, but without co-residence? Well, there's some interesting trends here as well. And again, they're slightly different among our lowest income households and those with more financial resources. So if you look at the panel on the right, this is again the lowest income older adults. And we can see that although those who are age 65 to about 80 are now currently less likely to live in their own home without co-residence, those who are over about age 80 are more likely currently than what they were in 1980 to live in their own home without co-residence. And that change is actually fairly large. So among the oldest old, it's about a 20 percentage point change. So it's approaching the size of that decline in nursing home residency that I showed you initially. The trend is similar among the oldest old for persons who have more financial resources, but the change is smaller. So the difference between the red dots and the squares reflects less change over time for our older adults who have more financial means. You might have been wondering about assisted living, and I was too. I think that there have been really dramatic changes in this industry over this study period, the last 4 decades. But what's quite interesting, at least in the data that I am able to use here, and all of this comes from decennial census and American Community Survey data, is that it's quite hard to measure and pick up the shares of people who live in assisted living arrangements. And so one of these limitations to the work that I do and to really our understanding of long-term care as a whole is the lack of good data about assisted living. But with that caveat aside, you can see what you might expect to see. Assisted living has become more prevalent since 1980, but perhaps you may not have expected that the most dramatic increase is among the lowest income older adults. Now, please do be aware, look at my y-axis here. There is a bit of a change. We're only talking about a 5 percentage point change from the squares to the dots on that right-hand panel at its largest. So this trend is small relative to what I just showed you about older adults aging in place without co-residence. But nonetheless, I think that the assisted living trend is an important piece of this story. And so we're going to dig a bit further into this. So it might be surprising that I find the biggest increase in assisted living is coming from those with the least financial means, because as we know, assisted living is quite expensive, right? Well, it is, and it helps to put it in perspective and talk a bit about some of these costs. And just like anything in healthcare, there's the full price, but then we also need to think about what resources we have in terms of insurance and public programs that might help to cover those costs. So as many of you may be familiar with, nursing home care is extremely expensive. What I'm showing you here is the annual cost of nursing home care according to the 2020 Genworth Cost of Care Survey. It's over $100,000. Home health care and assisted living, according to this survey at least, are fairly similar in cost, but what I'm comparing is full-time home health care, not part-time. And what families use when it comes to home health care may vary quite a lot in terms of the frequency and intensity of their use. Assisted living is still quite expensive, about $50,000 a year. And so that's about 5 times the average cost of childcare. And it's more than 1 year of tuition at some of the most elite private schools in the country. These are massive financial burdens for families. And this is why, although families may not have had any experience with Medicaid or other low-income support programs previously, shortly after older adults enter into nursing home care, for example, it is common for them to become Medicaid eligible because they exhaust their own financial resources quite quickly. Now, what's a little bit challenging is how people can pay for home health care or assisted living or adult daycare. All of these would be considered community-based care. And the extent to which you can use some public programs like Medicaid to pay for that type of care really depends on where you live, because Medicaid is a state program. And so in some states, there is support for care in these settings. In all states, there is support for care among those who qualify in a nursing home setting. Let me show you what that means if I come back to these trends in assisted living and illustrate why I think this policy is important, or the policy environment in one state is important. So again, here's that increase in assisted living that I showed you earlier, going from 1980 up to 2018. And here again, I'm going to zoom in just on the lowest income adults where we had the larger gains. And I'm going to add in those additional decades in between. And you can see that the series really separate, and we see the prevalence of assisted living grow among the oldest old after 1990. And what happened in that intervening period is there was the Supreme Court Olmstead decision in 1997 that indicated adults should be able to use their public benefits to pay for care in the least restrictive setting. And at this point, this started to change the way in which many state Medicaid programs covered care. Many of the waiver programs came into play at this time. But again, the rollout was not instantaneous, and it's not even across states. Even still, there are big differences in what you can pay for with some of these programs, depending on where you live. And there have been subsequent programs that have tried to rebalance or provide more access to home and community-based care, including legislation that was part of the Affordable Care Act. So I mentioned to you that I would clarify just a little bit about supplemental security income as well. I've mentioned Medicaid quite a bit, and Medicaid may be more familiar to you It is what many older adults rely on to pay for nursing home care. It is a means-tested program, meaning that there are income and asset limits. But also for Medicaid to cover either nursing home care or in most states, home and community-based care as well, you need to have an institutional level of care need. So that means that there is some sort of health determination, broadly speaking, across most programs that is required. That differs a bit from the Supplemental Security Income Program. So SSI is different from your old age insurance benefits. It's not the same as what most people think of as Social Security. This is a means-tested program that is available for persons over age 65 without any disability determination. Younger people can receive SSI as well, but that requires a disability determination. The income and the asset limits that apply for SSI are actually quite similar and in many states identical to what applies for Medicaid. And in some states, there are supplemental payments that help older adults pay for room and board or other necessary daily living expenses. So supplemental security income is income support that goes to the older adult. It can be used to pay for resources while they are living in their own home, but benefits are reduced if they move into a nursing home, because in that eventuality, the assumption is they are Medicaid eligible. Medicaid would cover room and board. It's also important to note, we talked about co-residence earlier, that SSI benefits are reduced in situations where an older adult moves in with, for example, a family member like an adult child, unless the older adult is contributing to room and board expenses. And so some of those financial discussions that you have about caregiving and planning really will need to get into the very detailed discussions of who will pay for what if you expect to be a financial caregiver for a person who may qualify for some of these programs. Now, before I close out and I hand the ball over to my colleague Yulya to talk a bit more about family caregivers, I want to share just a brief personal anecdote. The picture from my first slide is actually my grandfather, and this is him. I believe he was about 84 in this picture, and he's sitting on the front porch on his farm in Michigan, and he's talking to my son. And I'm sharing this with you because my family, like many, had trouble having these sorts of discussions with him. And we avoided some of the tougher questions probably longer than we should have. And that meant that he and my grandmother were relying on informal care from family and living in their home probably past the point when it was optimal for them to be doing so. They were quite low income, but high asset as farmers. And it's especially those sorts of situations that you want to be cognizant of as a financial caregiver. These aren't comfortable discussions, but it's a whole lot less comfortable to live with the results of not having those discussions. So I hope that our talk today and sharing some of this research is helpful to you as you navigate these challenges in your own lives. Yulya, I'll go ahead and pass it over to you now.
All right, thank you very much, Mary, and thank you to Lisa and the Cfpb for the opportunity to be here today and to share some of my own work here. So I study family caregiving almost exclusively, and like Mary, and probably like most of you here, I also come to this topic with quite a bit of personal experience. So here I have some pictures of my grandparents taken at different points in time. So I'm in some of these here because my grandparents took care of me a great deal when I was a kid so that both of my parents could work full time. And then they subsequently needed a great deal of care themselves as they got older. And despite the fact that they had formal caregivers, which they accessed through the Medicaid program, my mother took on a great deal of the care work, and for a period of about 10 years until they passed away, juggled a full-time job and almost daily care for both of them. And that motivates a lot of the questions that I have about how families really navigate these decisions around family caregiving. So I have a very similar disclaimer, identical disclaimer to Mary, in fact. Gratefully acknowledge financial support from the SSA, and they are not responsible for anything that I say today. So I'll start just by highlighting something that we all know. Caregiving goes far beyond the parent-child relationship across, and really stretches across the life course as a fundamental part of all of our lives. We all likely either are ourselves or know somebody who is providing a loved one with regular care. 53 million Americans are supporting a parent, a disabled child, or a spouse that has a chronic illness or a disability. This is according to a 2020 study by AARP. And 1 in 3 grandparents regularly care for grandchildren. So that caregiving goes both up and down in terms of generations. And I want to highlight kind of 3 features of family caregiving that I think are particularly important. First is that family caregiving, in particular to adults, has become increasingly complex. So about 6 in 10 family caregivers who are providing care for an elderly family member are regularly performing some kind of medical or nursing task. And this is again, according to the AARP. And so what this means is, as kind of Mary showed us, this trend away from institutional care and towards in-home care, right? A lot of those caregiving roles that can be a little bit more difficult and a little bit more medically involved are actually happening in the home and being carried out by family members who may not have a great deal of medical training. The second key trend is that the majority of caregivers also work. Now, we focus on this tension between caregiving and work a lot when we're thinking about parents of young children, but this is also true for caregivers of the elderly. So we know that over half of family caregivers also work. And not only do they work, but they are breadwinners in the sense that they are responsible for a substantial part of a family's income. And finally, demographic trends and policy changes are suggesting that this need for family care and the demand for family care is only going to increase. Okay, so we know that the US population is aging, and we also know that there's been a shift in both kind of a community perspective and also a policy perspective for more people to get care at home, to age in place, age in the community, and kind of have that long-term care provided to them rather than be an institution such as a nursing home. Okay, so let's look at some trends over time. So Mary showed us some trends in informal institutional care. Right? And she mentioned that there are less adults living in nursing homes. So in this graph, I'm going to show some trends over a shorter time period. But here we're focusing just on community dwelling adults who may qualify for a nursing home. Right? So these are adults who experience 2 or more limitations with activities of daily living. Right? So these are people that could be potentially in a nursing home, but are aging at home in the community. And I want to highlight 2 things here. So first, the share of these adults who have high care needs, but who get no care, and that's this orange, the top of the orange bar, has fallen since 2004. And overall, that's a very good thing. So there's less unmet need, right? More people who have care needs are having those needs filled. The second thing I want to highlight is that this space, this increase in care, is filled by those who are getting either both formal or informal care. Now that's that kind of bluish purplish set of bars, or only informal care. And that's a kind of goldish colored bars. Okay, so we see an increase either in both formal and informal care or only in informal care. And so none of this care is being provided by formal care only. And in fact, very few of these high needs older adults are getting only formal care when they're at home. So family care, right, is growing. And even in cases where formal care is available, where people are getting formal care, family care is a supplement rather than a substitute for that care. When people are aging in place, families are always going to be involved, no matter what. And so given, right, that we expect this large increase in the need for family care and in families providing care, I spend a lot of time thinking about what is the impact of this family caregiving on employment, right? That's really the focus of my research agenda. And I'm really only going to be able to give you a very kind of quick summary of what I've been finding recently. But just a short snapshot. But as I mentioned, right, many caregivers are also breadwinners, right? They are employed and they contribute substantially to their household income. And in fact, about 73% of caregivers are employed in the year before they start caregiving. Okay? Once they start caregiving, right, their likelihood of work falls by between 3 and 5% in the first 2 years. Okay, so the average caregiving spell lasts about 3 to 5 years, right? And we see kind of an immediate and sustained decrease in employment over the first 2 years. And many caregivers who leave work never return. And this is true even for those younger caregivers who may not qualify for retirement at the time when they leave work in order to provide care. Okay? And this early kind of pullback from the labor market, this non-participation, can have significant implications for the long-term retirement security of those caregivers who are themselves most commonly adult children of the elderly or nearing retirement themselves, and who may have caregiving needs in the future. So finally, I found that many future caregivers reduce their employment even before caregiving starts. Right? And what this means is that the anticipation of future caregiving needs is going to change the way that people make decisions about work even before they've started caregiving. Okay, so even thinking, right, that your mom may need help in the future is going to impact maybe the kind of job opportunities you pursue, whether you accept a promotion, whether you choose to move to a different city or a different state in order to pursue an opportunity. Okay, so family caregiving, even the anticipation of family caregiving, can have a substantial impact on the financial well-being of caregivers. And finally, while it's not been a focus of my research, I want to highlight that along with these impacts on financial health, caregiving can also have impacts on the physical and mental health of caregivers. So there's been a lot of really important work that has shown impacts on financial and mental health. Okay, so now I'm going to switch gears a little bit and pivot to talk about what has been very present for all of us over the last year plus, COVID-19. Okay, so you know, in my kind of reading of what's been going on in the discussion in research and in policy, there's been a lot of evidence on how COVID-19 has disrupted formal care settings, right? Whether that be nursing homes, but also child care centers and other formal care arrangements. There's been significantly less focus, from my perspective, on care provided in the home, on family caregiving arrangements. Okay? And the family caregiving is important for a number of reasons, right? Not least of which is that the majority of the elderly do get their care at home as we've discussed, right? The majority of high needs elderly are not in nursing homes. They're at home being cared for by a combination of formal and family caregivers. Okay. And this context, right, especially at the heights, kind of during the first wave of the pandemic and at the height of COVID-19, was also susceptible to high risk of COVID-19 transmission, right? And national data is somewhat scarce on this question of what was happening to family caregiving arrangements. And I was lucky enough to have the opportunity to participate in a study last year that was led by some colleagues of mine at the University of Michigan, which is called the COVID-19 Coping Study. And the objective of this study was to look at the impact of the early COVID-19 pandemic on the well-being of older Americans, you know, to their experiences, their subjective and mental health, how they were coping, changes in employment, and other factors. So I'll tell you a little bit about the sample in the study, and then I'll show you some key results. So the study included respondents who were at least 55 years old, currently living in the US. It was administered in 2 languages, so these are English or Spanish speakers. Respondents were recruited between April and May of 2020 by a professional survey company. So you can think of this as a national sample, a snapshot of Americans 55 and older living in all 50 states during the very first kind of early first wave of the COVID-19 pandemic. Okay. And the respondents in this study participated in a 20-minute online questionnaire where they were asked a whole bunch of questions. You know, so we collected some information about demographics, about employment, about whether or not they had COVID, their own physical mental health, kind of what were they doing in response to COVID, how were they changing their behaviors, what were they worried about, and we had a module on family caregiving. So we asked people if they were providing care to a family member before the start of the pandemic, and how their caregiving behavior had changed as a result of the pandemic. And to my knowledge, this is the only data that we have available about how these caregiving arrangements changed in the first wave of the pandemic. Okay, so what did we learn? First, we found that over half of respondents who identified as family caregivers before the start of the pandemic reported that their caregiving was disrupted in some way. So about 30% said that they found themselves, as a result of the pandemic, providing more care or taking on new caregiving roles. And about 20% said that they were providing less care or were unable to provide any care at all, right? Were unable to carry out those roles. And among those caregivers who were providing more care, right, so who were taking on new roles or who were expanding the time that they were caregiving, right, those caregivers tended to be younger, still within that 55 and older group, were more likely to be female, were more likely to be Black or Hispanic, and were also more likely to be employed prior to the pandemic. So what we find is that additional extra caregiving responsibility, right, is being shouldered by the same people who we know are also experiencing or bearing the brunt of the pandemic in other ways as well. Okay, so you know, given that we found this very large percentage of families who are experiencing caregiving disruptions, we wanted to know what impact these disruptions were having on caregivers, right? Or if there were correlations between caregiving disruptions and the well-being of caregivers. Now, we don't know anything, of course, about the care recipients, okay, but we did ask caregivers about kind of their self-reported mental health. So we have depression symptoms, anxiety symptoms, symptoms of loneliness, and well-being. And we wanted to look at the relationship between those outcomes and caregiving disruptions. Okay, so this is kind of a complicated graph, but I'm gonna talk through it slowly. Okay, so we split the sample into 4 groups. Our reference category is going to be non-caregivers, so people who are not providing any care prior to the pandemic. Okay, we then compare those to people who are caregivers, but who experience no disruptions. Okay? And so this first top set of bars here, this kind of gray, blue, greenish bars, right, is for that 50%, just under 50% of caregivers who experience no disruptions. Okay? And I'm charting the difference in their mental health outcomes, right? Their rates of depression, anxiety, and loneliness and self-reported health are no different than people who are not caregivers. Okay, so they look very similar compared to non-caregivers. However, those next 2 groups, right, we're looking at those caregivers who experience disruption, either by having to provide more care or being unable to provide care. Right? So we see that among those 2 groups who experience disruptions, we see much higher, we see that those caregivers who experience disruptions are much more likely to experience elevated negative mental health outcomes, such as higher depression, higher anxiety, and higher loneliness than non-caregivers. So there's clearly some important relationship between caregiving disruptions in particular, right, and increased symptoms of stress and anxiety and depression, right, that have sort of that are brought out by COVID-19. And overall, I think COVID-19, the experience of the last year, has brought really into focus what we all know to be true, which is that caregiving arrangements, right, and many of which are often cobbled together between some formal, some family care, can be extremely fragile. Right? And disruptions, when they arise, and they arise quite often, it can be very hard to deal with if you're unprepared, and can have big impacts on caregivers, both through their impacts on their economic well-being, their employment, but also their mental health and their ability to cope with their responsibilities. And I just wanted to end with this headline that I saw in the New York Times just last week, right? So COVID forces families to rethink nursing home care, which highlights that COVID-19 may have actually accelerated this trend that Mary highlighted for us early on, of families moving away from nursing homes and towards home care, which is going to inevitably involve more family caregivers. Okay, so thank you very much, and I will pass it on to Lisa.
Thank you so much for those really interesting presentations, and I'm looking forward to getting to the questions from the audience soon so that we can learn more from your presentations. But first, I want to tell you a little bit about the CFPB resources for financial caregivers now that you've heard about some of the caregiving trends. Again, my name's Lisa Schifferle, and I'm a senior policy analyst in the CFPB's Office for Older Americans. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the CFPB's Managing Someone Else's Money Guides, which are great resources to support financial caregivers. As you heard from Mary with the story about her grandfather, sometimes it can be hard to have these conversations with loved ones about planning for caregiving needs. So these guides are here to help you with that. Just like the other speakers, I also have to give a disclaimer, which is that anything I say is my opinion and does not necessarily reflect the opinion of the CFPB. Now, let me begin by telling you just a little bit about the CFPB's Office for Older Americans. Our office engages in research, policy, and educational initiatives to help protect older consumers from financial harm. And we also create tools and resources to help older consumers make sound financial decisions as they age. We have a whole lot of resources you can use or view online and order in bulk for free. And you can find those all at consumerfinance.gov/olderamericans. Right now, I want to start by highlighting a brand new resource that was just released this week. And this is part of our Managing Someone Else's Money Guide. And it's called Considering a Financial Caregiver. This new piece is really designed for people early in the caregiving process. Maybe you're just starting to notice that a loved one may need help with managing their finances, or maybe you're planning ahead for your own financial future. And so this piece helps you know your options so that you'll be able to choose what works best for your situation. Basically, the new publication covers informal caregiving options like convenience accounts or adding a trusted contact person to your account. It also covers formal caregiving options like power of attorney, guardian, trustee, or government fiduciary. And finally, it gives you a list of questions to help you consider who's the best person to choose as your financial caregiver. You can find this at consumerfinance.gov/MSEM, and we hope you'll check it out and order copies and share them in your community. I'm going to tell you a little more in depth about what you'll find in this piece. As I said, it covers 3 different kinds of informal caregivers. So if you're just starting out in financial caregiving, then an informal caregiver may be the right choice. It's basically someone who helps on an as-needed basis, and these are the 3 different types of informal caregivers we discussed. The first is a conversation partner, and this is basically just when you give a trusted relative, friend, or professional an overview of your finances. You can share as much or as little as you want, and you're not giving up any control. My mother actually recently did this with me, and I found it very helpful. She's still able to manage everything herself, but if God forbid something happens and she's not able to, I then know where all her accounts are and what they are in case I do need to step in. So this conversation partner is just starting that conversation with a loved one. It can be as simple as asking that person to come with you when you visit your banker or financial advisor, or just giving them information about what accounts you have so they know how to step in if needed. Another informal caregiving option is what's called a trusted contact person. And if you name a trusted contact person on your brokerage account, that allows the financial institution to contact the trusted person in certain circumstances only, like if they think you're being scammed. So trusted contacts are something that's available on all brokerage or investment accounts, and you may also be able to get them from other banks and financial institutions or credit unions. So just ask them about putting a trusted contact or emergency contact on your account. It's important to know that these trusted contacts do not have access to your money. They just get notified if the financial institution sees signs of financial exploitation. For example, if somebody is wiring a large sum of money to what appears to the financial institution to be a scammer. Now, another informal option we talk about is a convenience account. This is when you name someone to help you deposit or withdraw money and write checks. It's not the same as a joint account, which people often think of when they're managing someone else's money. The convenience account does not change ownership of the money in the account or give your helper the right to the money when you die. The money belongs only to you. So it can be a really good option. Sometimes people think of joint accounts for managing money, but this can have unintended consequences. For example, say if my mother put me on a joint account so I could help manage her money, if she were to pass away, the money would all go to me in a joint account, but she might have wanted it to go to my brother too. And also if I got in debt, then they could come after her money. Whereas a convenience account does not have those issues. So it's a good thing to consider in terms of informal caregiving. Now the guide also talks about formal caregivers, power of attorney, guardian or conservator, trustee, and government fiduciary. These are all types of relationships that we have actually in-depth guides about that I'll talk to you about in a minute. But this considering a financial caregiver document just lays out all the options for you to give you a real quick overview. It also gives you tips on choosing a financial caregiver and questions you can ask, like, do I trust this person? And do I feel comfortable sharing my wishes with them? Is this someone who's going to listen to and honor my wishes? And are they willing and able to take on the responsibility? And it's, a good time to think about the tough issues like, drug abuse or alcohol abuse, bankruptcy, or mental health challenges that may make a family member not necessarily the best person to be your financial caregiver. Think about whether it's someone who can manage the money and property in your best interests and keep good records. Now you can find all the questions and a lot more in that whole new guide at consumerfinance.gov/MSEM. You'll also find these in-depth guides for formal financial caregivers. These guides help financial caregivers understand their duties, and they help them. They have information on identifying benefits a care recipient can be eligible for. They provide tips and resources to help fiduciaries protecting, investing, and managing money. And they also describe warning signs of financial exploitation. They cover 4 different types of formal caregivers. The first one is a power of attorney. This is the most common one. This is when, in a legal document, someone known as the principal gives someone else legal authority to make decisions about their money if they are no longer able to do so. In some states, it's called a durable power of attorney. But really, the important thing to know, a lot of people say, why should I get a power of attorney? They give you control to name who you want to manage your finances, and also make it easier for your loved ones if you do become unable to manage your finances. You'll hear a little bit about why when you hear about guardianship in a minute. But basically, you retain control until you're no longer able. So the power of attorney is really the #1 financial planning document to think about when you're getting into the formal caregiving. Now, we also have a guide for government fiduciaries. If your loved one gets government benefits from Social Security or the Veterans Administration, then they may need what's called a representative payee or VA fiduciary. That person manages only the government benefits. The authority does not extend to any other benefits. So if you're a government fiduciary, you can manage that person's benefits, but you don't have authority over everything else. You need to get an additional authority like power of attorney in order to have that. So this is a good guide to actually bring with you and give to people, because oftentimes people don't fully understand the role of government fiduciaries. There's also a guide that we have about guardianship, and this is when the court steps in to name someone to manage money or property. So if you don't have a power of attorney, and say you get into a car accident or have a stroke, then your family may need to go to court and get guardianship. And this can be a longer, more costly and cumbersome process than power of attorney. It can be very helpful, but it also gives you an idea of why you may want to think about getting a power of attorney when doing financial planning. But if you are a guardian, this is a great guide to help you through the process. And the last guide we have is our guide for trustees. We're talking about revocable living trusts in this guide. The revocable living trust is a legal document, and basically it sets aside some of your assets. Like you could just put your car in a trust, or you could put $40,000 in a trust, and that money in the trust goes to the person who you name if you become sick or injured or unable to manage your finances. It also passes on to that person after you pass away. So the trust is another formal type of financial caregiving relationship you may want to look into and consider, and the guide gives you a lot more information about that. So those guides are all our managing someone else's money guides, which again are available at consumerfinance.gov/MSEM. I also want to let you know about our pandemic-related resources at consumerfinance.gov/coronavirus. Here we have resources in a variety of different languages on a bunch of different topics that can help you financially protect yourself during the pandemic. It includes credit and debt management, student loan repayment, what to do if you're behind on your mortgage or rent, scam prevention, and a lot more. It also has some great short videos, and it's really the best place to check back for up-to-date information. Now, this next slide has all of our contact information for the Office for Older Americans. We really do want to be a resource to you. So please check out all of our materials at consumerfinance.gov/older-americans, and you can order any of them for free at consumerfinance.gov/order. And once again, in celebration of Older Americans Month, we do hope that you'll take the materials and everything you learned today and make your community stronger. So now I am going to turn to your questions, and I see a lot of them have already come in, but feel free to add more. One question I see here is, has anyone seen an increase in elder financial abuse during COVID-19? And I can start by saying that I know that there's been an increase in scams against older adults and against really all age groups during the pandemic. If you look at the FTC's Consumer Sentinel data, you'll see a significant increase during the pandemic. But I don't know if our other speakers want to add anything to that question about whether scams and fraud have increased during the pandemic.
I haven't seen anything specific. Again, I would imagine yes. You know, the trick with that question is, with a lot of these family caregiving questions, is data collection. Is, you know, where is the evidence? You know, where can we see the evidence of that fraud taking place?
Okay, thank you. And here's a really interesting question. Someone's asking whether there have been comparisons studied between longevity and health when aging at home as opposed to nursing homes or assisted living. I think that's something we all wonder about when considering our loved ones and even our own future. Mm-hmm. Are either of you aware of any studies that talk about that?
So I will give what is perhaps a slightly frustrating answer to that one. It is a little bit difficult to answer that question well, because oftentimes we think about the long-term care continuum, and nursing homes tend to serve people with the most acute long-term care needs. And so then if we start to think about health outcomes, is it that there's something about the nursing home that isn't working as well, or is it that people who are more sick or have more complicated activity, daily living, or instrumental activities of daily living needs end up in that setting? So what I will say, though, is some of the quality metrics that are available, it does seem like for those people who have low care needs, perhaps there is better quality of care provided in a community-based setting. But measuring quality outcomes in community-based settings is a very open area of research right now. So I don't know if Yulya wants to say more there. I know that it's frustrating to be that circumspect about it, but that's honestly what we know at this point.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would definitely echo what Mary says. I think my kind of reading of what, again, is a very nascent but sort of expanding area of research, is that so far it appears that I think on average, for people kind of with a lower level of need, they do just as well at home as they might in a more kind of structured setting at much lower cost. While for higher needs adults, I think that is a much trickier question, and it's much less clear that there are benefits, in fact, to being at home. In particular, you know, higher needs, like, again, as I mentioned, you know, if you have very complex tasks that need to be carried out by a number of caregivers, and of course, it depends on what kind of resources people have at home. You know, if you can kind of replicate a 24-hour nursing home setting in the home, you know, perhaps if somebody will do just as well. You know, if you're relying on kind of a mishmash of like your neighbor and your, you know, two daughters, both of whom work full time, you know, that becomes a lot trickier. And I want to highlight also that when folks are at home, you know, that impact is on, I mean, in all contexts, the impact is on many family members, but, you know, family members end up taking a lot of care tasks on.
Thanks. And I think that segues nicely to another question that someone has, and I'm assuming that this refers to one of the slides in Dr. Hamman's presentation. Someone's asking whether the home health care cost is based on 24/7 care provided by agencies versus non-agency help.
Yeah, thank you. So the statistic that I'm using there is from the Genworth Cost of Care Survey, and I use their sort of standard comparison. But one thing that I will say is, if you're curious about digging deeper into those statistics, they do have a really user-friendly portal to alter your assumptions. But the statistic that I provided for you was the $54,912 for home health aid services. That was based on 54 hours per week for 52 weeks a year. So it is not 24/7 care. And that leaves the same sort of gap that Yulya was just referring to. So picture a family caregiver who perhaps that's how they make the daytime work while that individual is working. But if you're caring for someone, for example, with Alzheimer's disease, anyone with that experience, you know that sometimes the nights are where it gets really, really hard. And so we're not necessarily comparing apples to apples when we talk about the nursing home care versus the home health aid or even the assisted living statistics that I provided.
Thank you. That's a helpful explanation. There's another very interesting question. Someone's asking, what would you recommend for someone who has low income but assets that put them over the limits? I assume they mean the limits for eligibility for certain government programs.
Yeah. So my best recommendation would be to consult a financial planner or Medicaid specific planner, because the rules for example, spend down vary from state to state, whether or not you can qualify on the basis of being medically needy. So perhaps you have income above what would be otherwise considered the threshold for Medicaid eligibility. If your state has a medically needy program, you may actually qualify. When it comes to assets, the one thing that I will say is just be aware that if you gift something away or if you try to spend down assets at less than their fair market value, that then has to be considered in any sort of determination. So unfortunately, I can't give you one simple answer there and say it works this way in all states for all people, all situations. But this is a situation where I think it would be very smart, especially if you are thinking about someone like my grandfather with a farm or family business, high assets. It might be a good thing to consult a professional about.
Thank you. And I see there's a question about reverse mortgages, which we don't necessarily have statistics on, but we do have resources on. So I think they were put in the chat, but also I just wanted to recommend to people that the CFPB has resources on reverse mortgages at consumerfinance.gov/reverse mortgage. There's also a question here asking whether it's true that in nursing homes that are privately owned, the life expectancy is 5 years, as opposed to if they were owned by VC companies, it's 3.5 years. Is there a higher life expectancy in privately owned nursing homes, to your knowledge?
So it's hard to compare different kinds of nursing homes because not only is the ownership different, but the types of residents in those nursing homes may be different. I know that VC ownership is something that's been quite recent. I think over the last 20 or so years, there's been kind of a move of venture capitalist money into nursing homes. So I think it's kind of a relatively new phenomenon, and the types of nursing homes that they buy are going to be kind of different than than your average nursing home. So I think it's a little early still to kind of really do a clean comparison of whether VC ownership really changes the well-being of residents.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. And I see we're almost out of time, so I do want to close with one final question, which is that if there's one thing you'd like our listeners to take away from your presentation today, what would that be?
I think I hope that what you've gathered is a sense of the importance of having these conversations early. And while financial conversations may not be terribly comfortable, they are essential when you think about the sort of quality of care that you want your loved one to have in old age, but also the quality and financial health for yourself if you envision yourself becoming a caregiver as your loved one ages.
Yeah, and I would follow up with that to say that, caregiving arrangements are fragile. Health is fragile, and it's important to be kind of prepared for any number of changes because, a situation which may feel stable at one point in time may kind of quickly deteriorate or change, whether that's precipitated by a health change, the turnover of formal caregivers, or something like a global pandemic.
Thank you both, and thank you so much for sharing your time and expertise on this webinar. We really appreciate it. I know I learned a lot, and I hope everyone else did too. And again, in celebration of Older Americans Month and with the theme of communities of strength, we hope that everyone does take what they've learned today and pass it on to make your own communities stronger. Thank you, everyone, and have a great day.